Hello, my name is LoG and welcome to Quickies number 14, where I show you something that I think is cool in 5 minutes or less. Today comes at the request of a patron asking about how to transition from picking naturally, alternate picking style, into hybrid picking or using pick and fingers. So we're going to go over kind of the mechanics of hybrid picking, which will hopefully alleviate those problems. We're going to talk about two things in particular. That is what your hand should be doing when you're actually using the pick, because it might be slightly different than what you're doing when you're picking normal alternate picking style, as well as talk about planting the fingers on the strings while you're using this technique. So let's zoom into my right hand to get a better look. All right, we're going to talk about two things in regards to the mechanics of hybrid picking. The first thing is going to be how to actually use the pick while you're using pick and fingers, and then what to do with the fingers to make sure that things are comfortable and the notes sound full when you're using this technique. So the first thing, and this is kind of the main question that a patron had, which is why I'm making this video, and that is how to transition from picking normally, just like kind of alternate picking or doing whatever, to then using your fingers. This one is really important, because it might not be something that you realize right off the bat, but it's definitely happening when you're using pick and fingers. So it has to do with how you naturally pick a string. So there are a lot of different techniques that people use to pick the string in regards to how they're actually moving the pick, but there's one technique that I think might be somewhat of an issue when you're trying to use pick and fingers, and that is picking with the wrist motion like this. Kind of like, I don't know if you can see my wrist, but like pivoting off of your wrist like that. And this is a common way that people pick, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with this. But what can happen when you do that is when you're moving your wrist like that, you are, yes, moving the pick, but you're also moving your whole hand. So if I try to pick, let's say, this string right here, and I use that technique of like pivoting off my wrist, watch what happens. I pick the string, which is great, there's nothing wrong with that. I've picked the string, but now look at where my fingers are. They're way down here. So if I'm trying to maybe do like a pick and then two fingers, like something like that, if I'm picking with my wrist motion, my fingers are nowhere near where they need to be because my wrist just moved all of my fingers out of that position. So instead of using a wrist motion like this when you're picking, try to do one of two things. You can either use your fingers, like your thumb and pointer finger, to pick the string like this, like that. Of course, you're also going to get a much smaller pick stroke instead of using your wrist. Or you can, instead of using your wrist this way, you can do this sort of thing. So I'm not really moving my wrist, I'm kind of turning my arm. There's a name for this sort of motion, but I kind of think about it like you have a key and you put in a door and you turn it, right? It's not this sort of thing, it's more of this. So when you do that, you can pick the string, but your fingers generally stay in the same area, so they're still going to be ready to pick the string. So I'll show you what I mean. If I pick like just one note, I'll do it here on the D string like this. Watch what my hand looks like. My fingers are here and I'm going to pick the string, but notice what happens. I'm using my thumb and pointer finger to really strike the string, but I'm also turning just a little bit like this with my, not necessarily my wrist, but with my arm, and my fingers are able to stay in that one spot. They're not being forced out of position like they would if I did this, right? If I was picking more like that. If I did this sort of pick, right? My hand's down here and now my fingers are pretty far away from where they need to be. They need to be right here to pick the string. So if you want to practice this sort of thing, what I would do is pick, whatever string you want, play like a single note. How about let's play like the A string or something, and pick that note with a downstroke while keeping your middle and ring fingers on the next set of strings down. Don't use them, just sit them there and start picking the string like this. And force yourself to keep your fingers on the strings. Do not let your fingers leave the strings when you do that. They need to stay there. They need to be planted there, which means that your fingers, your picking technique is allowing your fingers to stay right there, and it's not forcing them out of position. So do something like this. You can even try like alternate picking, like that. Maybe do like pick hammer on or something like that. Sorry, my left hand in the shot. Right, so this is the next thing that I want to talk about. Try to do the same sort of thing, but jump strings while you do it. Make sure your picking technique, again, is not forcing your fingers out of position. So if I just run like a pretty simple like pentatonic scale, and I'm just going to do like pick hammer on, and you'll notice my fingers are all moving at the same time as they transition down to the strings, and the fingers that are planted, that are sitting right there, they're not being forced out of position because of my picking technique. So it looks like this. Like that. This brings me to the next topic of planting your fingers before you play. A lot of people, when they first start trying to use the hybrid picking technique, they do this sort of thing. Like, let's say I'm going to play just like a little chord like this. What they'll try to do is they'll say, okay, I'm going to pick the string, then I'm going to pick the next string with my middle finger, and then the next string with my ring. And they try to do something like this. Right? And there's nothing really wrong with that, but I think it's really important when you're first starting to practice this to plant the fingers before you pick them. So watch what happens. I'm going to pick this chord, same thing, or I'll do that one, and watch what happens. When my pick goes down to pick that string, my fingers also sit on the strings and they're planted, ready to go. So when I pick them, all I need to do is release the finger. So watch this. So right when I do that first pick stroke, bam, they're sitting there ready to go. Now obviously you might say, well, that doesn't work if you want all the notes to ring out loud and clear. Like if you want all the notes to ring out loud and clear, yeah, you need to not plant, because whenever you plant, the strings die. Like right there, these two strings are dead because I decided to plant on them. That's fine, that's something you can practice down the road, but just for the pure mechanics of getting comfortable with the technique, that's what I would do every time. Because what you're doing is you're working on your accuracy of having your fingers pick and then bam, come right back to where they need to be ready to continue. So if I do something like this, if I play a figure like this is more of a lead figure, not necessarily a chord figure, you can watch what my fingers do. Every time my pick goes to pick the string, my fingers sit on the next two strings that they are about to play. So something like this. Right? If I do that slow motion, bam, everything is ready to go. I just picked the string, my fingers are now sitting on the strings ready to go when they're ready. Bam, same thing. Bam, hitting that string, picking the string, fingers are there, ready to go. So if I want to play a figure like that, I'm putting everything down at once for each group, and that allows me to prepare those notes and for them to not only be comfortable but to sound better. This is kind of a pretty common fingerstyle way to play. So if you're playing like a particular scale passage or something, instead of doing this, just having your fingers floating in the air, it's very common for players to plant before you play. So it's not just like fluttering on top of the strings, you're actually pressing, then picking, pressing, then picking. You're not doing this all the time, because if you did it like hard, everything would sound staccato, and that can be cool, but if you want to pick normal notes, you need to be comfortable with floating a little bit, but there's still a little bit of a plant going on, because that good full fingerstyle tone doesn't come from just hitting the string. It comes from putting your finger on the string, pressing the string in ever so slightly, and then releasing. That's what gives it kind of the warmth and gets rid of like the kind of brittle, bright sound of just fluttering on top of the string like that. So we're doing the same thing here with the pick and fingers. We are planting the fingers before we actually strike the string, like this, which gives us a fuller tone, and it gets us more comfortable with preparing the sound or preparing the technique when we're about to use it. So some things that I would practice. Simply do this. Pick a couple times on every string, just like that. But every time you do it, have your middle ring fingers ready to go before you move. So just this. Next string. So see, everything's moving at once. Next string. Next string. Just like that. Notice also my picking technique, I'm not using a wrist motion, I'm using a lot of finger motion with a little bit of turn of the wrist, or a turn of the arm I should say, which allows my fingers to stay in one spot. And I'm also not like, I don't have a death grip on the strings either when I'm touching them. I'm just touching the strings like this, so that allows my fingers to move a little bit in case I need to, in case I'm moving, like picking up here and then moving back there. My fingers are loose enough to that they can slide on top of the strings to adapt whatever I want to do. So to practice this again, pick a string, do this, maybe do some alternate picking to get comfortable with not just the downstroke but the upstroke also. The upstroke for me, while my fingers are planted, feels a little weird, so I'm still kind of getting comfortable with that these days, but definitely practice both of them. And then start to do simple things like this, like maybe have a little 3-note chord in your left hand and just do pick, finger, finger. Then next string. Again, notice my fingers, what they're doing. Pick, planting, right after I pick, and then strike the strings. You can maybe try the same thing with an upstroke. Not as comfortable, but definitely has its value. So experiment with stuff like that, get comfortable with it. I think this really helps me kind of hone in on that technique and get everything comfortable when the hybrid picking is happening, and hopefully it works for you. See you guys in the next one.